So when I arrived at the Oslo Freedom Forum and saw the Bitcoin area, I was very, very confused. And my mind is like, I need to get my father out of prison. Like, why are these people here? And once you talk a little bit more, you understand really what Satoshi was thinking about, the application of Bitcoin, and you see where in communities that they're doing that. It's just really amazing.
Welcome, everybody. Frank Corva, White House and political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine, here with another episode of Bitcoin Politics. Today, we have a very, very special guest, Anaïse Kanimba. Anais is a Rwandan activist. She's done incredible work around the world. Most notably, some of her most recent work has actually been freeing her father from a very dire situation in Rwanda, where he was kidnapped and imprisoned. And since then, or maybe even a little bit of an overlap, she sort of joined the Bitcoin community. She's joined forces with HRF and some other organizations that I'm going to let her sort of talk about a little bit. And it might sound sort of like an unlikely match. We have this Rwandan activist who's freeing her father from the government's clutches, now sort of embracing Bitcoin as well. And also, just to kind of provide the big umbrella of what we'll touch on here, also starting the African Bitcoin Institute, a policy institute for Africa for Bitcoin. So let me stop there. Anais, if you could please introduce yourself a bit, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation with you and to join your community. So I'm from Rwanda, originally from Rwanda, but I've spent my time in Europe and in the United States. I did my education, mostly higher education in the United States. And I previously, before even everything began with my father, who was kidnapped and then illegally detained in Rwanda in 2020. I was working in development, doing mostly global health work, specifically on HIV/AIDS. But a big part of our work was to produce data for better decision making. And that was what I was doing for almost 6-7 years until I switched things up to advocate for my father, who was in Rwanda. And then I'll kind of go in more details how I got into Bitcoin, but I wanted to give that background because a big part of what I'm doing today kind of stems from my time in doing development work and having a lot of questions about how the system actually works. Is it really benefiting people? Are we seeing real growth? And how much do people have ownership? When I say people who are the beneficiary of our work, I work mostly in Africa, how much are they actually taking ownership of these projects in their own lives? And are we supporting that? So I've always been very interested in all aspects of human rights and personal liberties, and the work to be able to get to that is long, but this is something I've been able to express this. How was it? I've been able to talk about this and work on this in different aspects, right? From the health perspective, which I believe is right, but from owning your own bank accounts and the basic of everyday life, and also being a free person and being able to express your opinion.
100%. I don't know if you want to touch on it a little bit, what happened to your dad while he was there, what that process was like, and I don't want to get too into that. I do want to focus, obviously, this is for Bitcoin Magazine, but I do think it provides a really interesting context for the audience who might not be familiar with yours and his story.
Absolutely. So my father, his name is Rusesabagina. And for those who don't know, in 1994, we had a genocide in Rwanda where we have two big ethnic groups in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutu. But what's very different from the other words people may have heard about is that in Rwanda, we all speak one language, have the same religion mostly, celebrate the same culture. So it's just that one is called Hutu and the other one is called Tutsi. And these arbitrary distinctions between the groups were really pushed by the people who colonized us, the Belgian government. And so this context brings from colonization of the division to basically divide people to conquer them, right? This is what they did. And it created antagony between the two groups. One was in power, had a lot of favors by the Belgian government, which was the Tutsi. And when we get independence, the Hutu took power. And through that time, over the next 40 years until 1994, many Tutsi were being persecuted. And they used a lot of hate language, minimizing, dehumanizing the Tutsis, to the point where there was a small extremist group within the Hutu that decided to eliminate the Tutsis when they felt that they were threatened by people who were outside. And these people who were outside were Tutsi who had exiled because of persecution. So during this time, our country lived very horrific days of 100 days where almost 800,000 to 1 million people died, including my biological parents, Fident and Thomas Kanimba, because they were Tutsi. But Paul at the time was a Hutu man, and Paul who adopted me, and used his access because he was a manager to a hotel. So another context is that when the war started, as many people have heard, all the international folks, mostly Western, were evacuated within the first day. So this hotel was empty, and he decided to use this hotel as a place for refuge and saved over 1,000 people during those days. And that story was told in the movie Hotel Rwanda, which came out in 2004. And when my father story came out to the public, he used his platform to talk about the challenges our country was facing in the early 2000s, before then, and there's the growing autocratic tendencies that the new regime was going on. And so it put him in the against the government, essentially turned down like many autocratic countries. If you speak openly about what's happening there and say what they don't want you to say, then they'll come after you. So over the last 15 years, from 2004 to 2020, we had to move our homes several times, even though we're living in Europe, in the United States. We were being followed by the government until the worst happened to us when they kidnapped my father, who was in Texas. They lured him to Dubai and then put him in a private jet and then drugged him there. And he found himself in Rwanda, a place he had never been over 20 something years because of the fear of being killed. And so that forced me to stop my job in development at the time. And my family and I decided to take on this government that had taken our father and exposed the human rights violation, the lack of democracy, and all the injustices happening, but also had to work with governments, the United States government, the Belgian government, and others around the world, and get the support of anybody in the world who would be willing to see this injustice and support our father. And because we're getting a lot of support, the government got scared. The Rwandan government got scared, and they wanted to make sure that they were one step ahead of our advocacy. And that's when they put Pegasus on my sister's phone, who was doing a lot of the work in Belgium. And through HRF,
Anaïs, could I just ask if you just could give a brief description of what Pegasus is? Some people might not be
yes,
familiar
yes.
with it. Yeah.
So Pegasus is a malware that was created by the NSO Group, which is an Israeli tech company, that essentially allows. It was sold only to government, and it was supposed to track terrorists around the world. But of course, many countries also used it to track anybody that they wanted. And in mostly autocratic countries, they tracked reporters, opposition, human rights activists, democracy defenders, to make sure they would know what's happening at all time. And for us, I think it's like $1 million the software to use on a person. So it's very
Mm.
tool utilized by many countries that don't have a lot of money for other things. So there's also a question of where do you put the priorities, right?
Yep.
And they use that malware on my sister's phone and my cousin's phone, in fact, to be able to see what we were doing in our advocacy. So they would listen to our meetings that we had with government official. They had access to all our messages. It's as if that you have somebody's phone in your hand. You can see them putting the password. You can record without them knowing voices. So there's many things that you could do with this malware, and that just opened up a whole new world for us because our digital security was at risk as well too. In addition to our physical security, and a lot of our work was done online. It started during the pandemic, and then we continue to speak with people online via email and Zoom meetings and discussion like yours, like right now. And so it was a very scary moment when we found out this for our family. And we had never really known about the freedom tech movement and how much privacy support you can get from people who care about this issue. And a lot of people in the freedom tech movement came to us and helped us create better boundaries for ourselves, find tools that will protect ourselves through our advocacy. And in learning a little bit more about privacy, I also met many other activists who had been debanked, activists who had been kicked out of their country completely, could not access any of their assets. But we also had trouble, even us, getting money to the lawyers who were helping our parents, our dad. I mean, people being scared to donate to our legal defense fund because they were scared to be seen by
Connected to it.
connected.
Connected to it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's when I was hearing about Bitcoin. I was like, wait, like this tool could actually help us with what we're doing, but it's also helping a lot of other people who are in this situation. It was help. I was hearing stories of refugees who were not able to get documentation and would use Bitcoin as a tool to be able to access some kind of financing. We were refugees before we came to Belgium. So this is a path that we went through that was, over 20 years ago, but I could relate very quickly with some of the challenges and that Bitcoin was trying to solve, and thinking about my previous time as well too in development. I was able to connect a lot of the dots, and I saw this as a really incredible tool that can save the lives of people, and specifically, the people at the bottom of the ladder who are trying to make ends meet, people who are fighting against autocracy. But I didn't really pay attention too much. I was still trying to get my father out, but this community really embraced us and wanted to support in those days. Thankfully, our dad was freed in March 2023, and after he was freed, I started thinking a little bit more about what's next for me, and I continue to educate more a little bit about myself. Sorry, I continue to educate myself a little bit more about Bitcoin, and then I was told, and I want to be able to use my voice and what I've learned in advocating for my father, but other people in his situation, and the network that I've built throughout the time and my past in development and thinking about these growth questions. To apply that into this ecosystem, coming from a background that's completely not a technologist, but that appreciates what technology can do to the world in a better place.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that overview immensely. Thank you so much for doing that. Something you said last night, we were talking, and you said sort of like when people first introduced Bitcoin to you, the first thought that popped into your mind was like the crypto bros. And I say that you said it facetiously too. She didn't say it meanly or anything. But
yes, it was really interesting. And I have to thank HRF for that, because it was going to the Oslo Freedom Forum in 2022. I had heard about Bitcoin, but I had never fully understood what it can do. It was just this thing that people talk about. And, my background in development, it was these finance guys who were talking about these things. People were excited. And so it just felt very foreign. You almost create your own prejudice out that's something that you don't know because of the things that you hear. And I definitely felt for that. And so when I arrived at the Oslo Freedom Forum and saw the Bitcoin area, I was very, very confused. What this guy, my mind is like, I need to get my father out of prison. Like, what are we doing? Why are these people here?
Yeah.
And once you talk a little bit more, you understand really what Satoshi was thinking about the application of Bitcoin, and you see where in communities they're doing that. It's just really amazing. And yeah.
Yeah, there's not enough of that story being told, and so much so that someone like yourself, who, like you said, you kind of benefit from the technology and the community around it, you weren't even sort of aware of it or the benefits of it. It's kind of sad that so much of the media coverage doesn't necessarily focus on these really important use cases, but instead sort of number go up technology. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that there's a lot more to the story as well.
Exactly, and to that end, I think it was. I'm just thinking, Obi, who's with Fedi.
Yep.
I attended one of his talks, and one time he said that unless you need Bitcoin, you will never understand why Bitcoin is important, right? And not to excuse a lot of people, specifically in the West, but unless you've been put in a position where this is nothing, or you have nothing else to do, then you wouldn't. It's very hard to come across and to see that value immediately. You need to be able to hear the stories of people who are struggling from a financial perspective of having access to the financial system for you to fully understand how Bitcoin can be very, very helpful in your life, and I think in some of the work that I did in advocacy and the communications, that's what we learned. We had to figure out how to make people understand this important issue that many of them, many people I was talking to don't have family members who are kidnapped by government or, but you had to be able to make it relatable and remind and find where they can see the importance of our issue. And I think Bitcoin it comes into that perspective. We have to find a way to tell the story so people can understand, even if they will never come across a point where it's like they don't have the USD anymore and they have
Right.
to use Bitcoin. But there's a ability, there's ways you can get to make people see the importance of it from a human perspective.
Yeah. It sounds to me, based on the next project you're taking on, or a project that you've recently taken on, which is one of the founding members of the African Bitcoin Institute, a policy institute for Bitcoin in Africa, that you're going to be have to doing a lot more of this education and figuring out ways to relay this information to people who might not be familiar with it. So I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about that. What is the African Bitcoin Institute? Who else is involved? What are you hoping to accomplish?
Yeah, so the African Bitcoin Institute was an idea of a few other people, and I'm helping kind of putting it together. But it was Femi, who's worked in the technology space in Africa for a long time, but also works with HRF.
Just for the audience, Femi Long. Yeah.
Femi Longe,
Yeah. Yeah.
Femi Longe, who works with HRF, who has who has interesting past with the CC Hub in Nigeria and growth of programmers around the continent, and Farida, who leads the Africa Bitcoin Conference, Eric Hersman, who's working on gridless and an energy aspect of Bitcoin, and Ojoma, who's working with B Trust and also trying to create avenues for developers to develop new tools that can be helpful in this ecosystem. So they all saw this gap in terms of storytelling and the research and foundation of the data about Bitcoin adoption in Africa. And they brought me on to help them to kind of think about how we can build this institute so we can have a place, because one of the biggest gap, actually, if I can take a step back, in Africa, that's where, in Latin America and Asia, but that's where you see a lot of these new tools, these applications, ways of using Bitcoin. But the story is often written by people from outside of the continent. There's not a lot of research on what's happening on the day to day. And this gap is creating an issue because people don't know what's happening. Even me, when I was interested, like, well, tell me more stories. And it was difficult to find a one place where I can find this information, but also done in a rigorous way that doesn't just, blogs are fine, but it's one thing having like an expert in economics or an expert in computer science and others like writing about these questions and doing some empirical research and from the continent as well, who tell the story. And then from there, once you have all this body of information, you can make evidence-based decisions.
Yep.
And this is where it's important for the policymakers in Africa to be able to make decisions on the growth or the change in Bitcoin regulation or digital currency regulation, knowing what's coming from their own place and not copy paste of what's happening, in Washington, D.C. or in other countries, in other cities. It's important to have this guidance from around the world because it gives a blueprint, but copy paste doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for the local community. And and we've seen this in other aspects, even in the health, like the way COVID was handled, we copy paste everything that was being handled the way it was handled in Europe. But the lifestyle of people in Africa is very different. You can quarantine everyone to stay at home when everybody works at the market and move in population. So we saw this gap. And we also saw that a lot of the literature written about Bitcoin, again, is not written by Africans. And those who write about this are buried in the ecosystem of the production of the reports. So people will write about something happening in Lagos, post it online. Somebody's going to use that as a source, and then the other person uses that as a source. And by the time it gets published in like more, let's say, established journals or more established reports, then the voice of the people who actually gather this data is lost. And so we believe that in this time that there's a lot of development and growth, the narrative should be coming from people living it. And this is where ABI kind of takes a lead into that and support the network of these researchers, help people understand Bitcoin a little bit better, its challenges and its opportunities. And when you understand the challenges as well, you can build new tools differently. You can also do regulations differently. So we don't want to tell people this is the best thing in the world and you have to use it, but let's show you the evidence, because we see people using it and changing the people's life, and from there you can make your own decisions.
Yep.
And the wise decision will be to help grow this work. You know, yeah.
Are you allowed to tell them that that's the wise decision, or you're hoping that's what they come to on their own?
But
Yeah.
just like me, you come in as a skeptic and you see people's lives being changed and you cannot turn back, right? And
Yeah.
I think it's very hard to turn back. And like I say, you also have to humanize this tool and why people are using it, right? And if people can see themselves as beneficiary of this tool, then they'll also understand a little bit more. And many people in these countries that will be working in can be beneficiaries of this tool as well too. Yeah. So that human aspect is very, very important.
Yeah, appreciate that. Another question that I was thinking a lot about this. There's a tremendous amount of diversity within the continent, Africa, which is made up of, technically, I think it's 54 countries, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around there. Yeah. And then there's diversity within each of these countries. It seems like this immense undertaking to start the African Bitcoin Institute versus maybe the Senegalese Bitcoin Institute, and then the Ghanaian Bitcoin Institute, and the Rwanda Bitcoin. Why the African one versus one for each country, or maybe one like the East Africa? Like, only because it does seem like a massive undertaking to try to figure out a way to relate to all people across all different spectrums across Africa. Does that seem like a lot to you? And what was the rationale for making it just a project for Africa?
Yes, but you're right. It is a big undertaking, but it's important because we need to think about this as from a Pan-Africanist perspective.
Okay.
And also the way you'll see many countries kind of work and copy each other. So, for instance, in Francophone Africa, many countries in Francophone Africa follow what the regional central banks are doing, and are detecting to do. You have big market like in Nigeria or Kenya or South Africa that's very unique, but many of them in South Africa gives a blueprint to what's happening to the rest of Southern African countries. And so it is big, but it's important to see what's happening in all those places. Yep. And because there are a lot of regional collaboration from an economic structure. And also we want to partner and network, and there exist already some NGOs working and trying to do research in smaller countries. But with the network that we can bring, we can elevate that and make it more Pan-African and almost global, right?
Okay.
And so in terms of priority in the work, we're going to do an index on the status of Bitcoin adoption in many countries and regulations, and so have an idea of what's happening on the continent, but we'll dig deeper depending on the priorities of what we're looking in. So, for instance, if you're looking at mining, it's going to be really interesting to see the countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia, and others who are already doing that and what's working, what's not working. So each country also has a different perspective and shift. Like in Nigeria, you have a lot of startups happening, right? And so the questions that we're looking at are more startup related, and legislation that's much more advanced. And so each country we won't be looking at the same in all the countries, but there are commonalities from the economic structure of those places. But also we want for people to understand that this is a whole the whole continent effort, and to feel that there's no isolation, and that community network effect really goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were speaking, I'm thinking to myself too, Bitcoin being a currency that can be used across borders, whereas you have all these different countries and they all have these different currencies, some similar, like in Francophone Africa, the CFA, but Bitcoin being something that can connect Africa beyond these sort of artificial borders. So I think that's came to mind as you were speaking, for sure. On that note, so we obviously have these international remittance use case, and I want to stress a certain word as I ask this question. I want to say, in your mind, what problems can Bitcoin realistically sort of fix for Africa? And in the Bitcoin community, there's a lot of sloganeering, fix the money, fix the world, as if, if Bitcoin gets adopted, everything else that's wrong with the world will magically disappear. It's a theory that I don't subscribe to. While I do think that people having decent, non-censorable money that they control on their own can be a huge benefit. But there are many other factors that play into that. So in your mind, what are maybe the top 3 things that Bitcoin has the potential to fix in Africa or to help make better in Africa?
Well, some of the things that we've seen already that's happening mostly. So you have a lot of countries with inflation, and that's going up and down all the time, right? And people's savings, one day they have savings and the next day they don't have savings anymore because of the government decisions. And the Bitcoin is a good place for people to save, to make sure that there's more stability. A lot of people from the West will argue that Bitcoin is very volatile, but it's not as volatile as like the Zimbabwean currency that's moving, so it's about perspective, right?
Yeah.
So that's one important aspect. But then the one that's been used much more often is transaction and remittance from the West and back to Africa.
Yep.
And so, for instance, many people use MoneyGram and Western Union. The fees are crazy high for this. And we're not talking about people trying to make like hundreds of thousands of transactions. We're looking at, I need to send my aunt, 100 euros, $100. And from that, you get so much taken by these companies. And why? Because these African countries are seen as risk countries, right? So there's more scrutiny about the money transfer in these countries. And so Bitcoin doesn't discriminate that. It's not because my government has made bad decision that I am responsible for this government. And often what you will see is you have many autocratic countries on the continent. So the government doesn't really represent the people. So they shouldn't be penalized because of that. And so Bitcoin has been a really important tool for people to send money back and forth to and outside of the continent. Yeah. And then something that's really dear to me, important to me, is the people who are unbanked, people who don't have identification card, or people who are refugees. I come from Rwanda today. There is a war ongoing in Eastern DRC, and many people have lost their home. Many people are in refugee camps, and they need to have a way to live. You're living there for like months and months, even years sometimes, and you don't have papers. And without papers, you can't open a bank account. You can do much, but you have your phone, and that's the reality. A lot of people have phones today on the continent, and I can send some Bitcoin to my relative who could be in a refugee camp, and then that person can buy food, can buy whatever they need to stay alive, because we see this ecosystem. So what people don't realize is, in Africa, you often have to change your money from dollars to other places. So those little kiosks that you will do Western Union, there are a lot of them, and many of them also are taking Bitcoin, and they're working with bigger organization companies that support these type of transactions. And many of them are international, but there are a lot of local companies also helping with that. And so that's, I think, a really good example of how really Bitcoin is saving the lives of people. But then another aspect too that's really important is building movement, right? And so I come from a place where I'm a democracy defender, and often people that want to gather together, you need funding for this. And many people are afraid to send money to support the movement that they want to support, that's in the opposition, because everything is tracked in the regular banking system. And so people feel afraid to contribute. And I think this is also a way we've seen participation. I know a lot in Venezuela, it's working very well, supporting the democracy side of the political movement there. And so those are applications that I think Bitcoin can really provide an impact to and change the lives of people. But these are not problems people have in the United States or in Belgium. Yeah. So and that's where ABI comes into this, right? And we want to show this data, show this information to the rest of the world so they can have a better understanding of what's happening, have investment to support the work that's happening, get more people to program, to code, to do different solutions that can, continue helping the lives of people. Yeah, because at the end of the day, Bitcoin is freedom money, right? and I think that's a lot of people are looking for that and want to participate in that in that quest.
Yeah, for sure. They might not know it yet, or they haven't been made aware that it even
Yeah,
exists or what it is. And also, I think the big thing that I've seen, and this is across the world, not just Africa, but there are plenty of scams around it. So then you're also dealing with peeling back the emotional layers of like, oh, I've been scammed. I've heard about Bitcoin, but nobody actually taught them how to use a wallet properly and
exactly. Yeah.
use it the right way. Someone was
Hmm.
probably promising them to get rich, and it didn't
Hmm.
work out like that. So
Yeah.
that I've noticed is a very it's one of the
Mhm.
major challenges that people face. I'm super excited for you to be doing this work. I think it's really, really important. And I guess just a final question. I know you're kind of based around the world. You tend to just sort of go where you're needed around the world, but you do have a bit of a home base, in the United States as well. And I would imagine you're sort of paying attention to what's going on politically here
Mhm.
around Bitcoin. I know you said, and this is for better or worse, it's probably for worse in a lot of instances, but oftentimes legislation that comes out of the United States gets copied and pasted globally, or an institution like the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, will just sort of pick it up, and then that'll become sort of a
Mhm.
global standard for something. Do you think we're getting things right in the United States when it comes down? You don't have to get too deep into this, but are we moving in a good direction when it comes to Bitcoin adoption? And I'll give a little bit more context there. Some people argue, sure, new administration is maybe friendly to like the industry, and now we have more regulated ETFs, but are we really sort of fighting for P2P rights? And,
Mhm.
is this the sort of what we're doing here? Is this the sort of stuff we want to see exported globally? How much are you paying attention to it? What are your feelings about it?
Oh, we're paying attention to it very closely because it's important. And you have to start from somewhere, right? We're coming from a place where it was almost pushed aside, this conversation, right?
Yep.
And we live in a digital world. Digital currency are here to stay. We're gonna find places to, whether it's like stable coins or other. This is conversations that we need to have.
Yep.
These are so I'm really happy that this administration is putting these questions forward. The regulators are thinking about it because it does give a sense of it encourages other countries to also think critically about it. I mean, at the
Yep.
end of the day, the United States is a leader in the world in the financial system. There's literally the word in innovation, and so people pay attention to that, right?
Yep.
And so, a time where if the administration was saying all of this are scams and this just for bad people, then you can imagine the conversation we'll be having in Africa will be very similar. Regulators will be feeling the same way. And if regulators feel like that, then the people using Bitcoin P2P like will be affected,
Yep.
right? And so for me, where I come from is if we have a conversation and we can guide the conversation in the right direction, and you have to start from somewhere, then it supports the beneficiary of the people who are at the bottom, who really need this, who need that $100 to survive for the next month,
Yep.
coming from their loved one in the United States or in Belgium. So all to say, it is important what's happening and where the conversations happening today, but we need to be very careful that we don't just copy and paste what
Right.
implication of it. But I think it's good. I think it's good, and it's encouraging the rest of the world to think about it. And it's not this foreign thing so much anymore, But we don't want a lot of like meme coins out there and
Yeah.
everybody take
Yeah.
advantage of it, And this is where the education is very important, right? And
Yeah.
it's where education even. I live in Washington D.C., and a lot of my friends are the World Bank, IMF, people who don't really think about this as even as an option,
Yeah.
but because of it gets so diluted with a different language and how people talk about it, I find myself reminding them that like, Bitcoin is not the same thing as like a meme coin or anything like
Totally.
that. And so there's education to be done. And the fact that the government is paying attention in a serious way, then it forces people to also question their own assumption on what they believed and what it was. And then also then have an opinion if it's good or not, where the direction goes. But at least you have some you're questioned a little bit and
Yep.
you have to start from somewhere. So I like that. I like what's happening.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
last question, just in terms of starting from somewhere, when it comes to Bitcoin, there's sort of a lot of almost, in some ways, there's some prerequisite frameworks that people need. So it's just basically digital literacy, how to use a phone and how to use these apps and all that. But then if you want to really zoom out, it's like what is money?
Yes.
Why
Yeah.
does money inflate? Why is this
Yeah.
happening to my money?
Mhm.
Do you find it challenging, and with this work that you're doing, do you find it challenging to sort of almost find that entry point? Like, where do you start? Or is it simpler? Is it just sort of like, well, let's just start with the problem that it solves for someone, teach them how to use it to solve that problem, and then maybe expand from there if we even need to expand from there? Your thoughts on that?
Like you just said, I think you start from the problem, and that's why we've seen more adoption from peer-to-peer adoption of it in places like in Africa, because they're trying to solve specific problems. And in Africa, it's a lot of young people. Like the majority of the continent is below like 35. I mean,
Right.
even
Right.
making that the number higher than it is.
Yep.
And so that learning curve is not as high as maybe you would see in different regions of the world,
Yep.
because many young people, they grew up on phones. Most people have phones, are digitally literate, so that makes it easier. And also, when you have a problem, and specifically if it means that you need to feed your family by the end of the week, you will figure it out how
That's
to
right.
how to
Yeah, that's
use
true.
it, right?
Yeah.
And so from a tech, and then of course you take a step back, right, and you say, but why are we doing this, right? And again, when you live under autocratic regimes, when you live in places where you're not as empowered financially, then you start questioning why you're not empowered. And here, the beauty of the places like we live in the United States and in Europe, you don't have to question that, because things are kind of handed to you, or that's how the system is. So you would think that that macro level perspective understanding is difficult, but it's not, because
Mm,
these are like you thinking about your rights all the time in
right.
these cases. And so that is something that comes into it. But definitely there is a need to continue the education, and that education is even more needed at the highest level of government in many countries in Africa, because people at the highest level of governments are not facing the same
Right.
problems that the person at the market is facing, right? And their understanding of the technology is going to be more difficult. So it's actually on the reverse. But the everyday person, it's much quicker, because it's a problem that you need to solve,
Yeah.
and Bitcoin is there to support that, as a solution.
Amazing stuff. I'm super excited to watch as ABI develops. Obviously, please reach out if anything. If we're in touch with the Bitcoin Policy Institute here, and I'm sure you are as well. But I think we're all really excited to see something like this coming off the ground. Personally, I really like to see sort of, as you said, bringing more African voices into the literature here. I think that's really, really important, that people get to, people with certain backgrounds, as you said, whether that's something technological or economics or something along those lines. And then also who have the lived reality on the ground, get to speak to these issues. I think it's something that's largely missing right now in the Bitcoin space. So super
Mhm.
excited to see ABI providing that. On that note, where can people go to find out more and to follow what ABI is doing?
So first of all, if anybody's in New York today, if they will see
Yeah, no, they won't see it in time.
it, come to
Yeah, yeah. We'll shout out to Pubkey. Anais is speaking at
yeah.
Pubkey later. Yeah,
Hopefully, we'll also do something similar in Washington D.C. In
cool,
the coming weeks. But you can
cool.
also find us. We have a website, the African Bitcoin Institute. We have a page on LinkedIn. We have a page on X, and on Primo. And so we're getting started putting some of the work that we're doing there. And you can
Cool.
always reach at me directly, Anaïse Kanimba. That's my handle on X as well too.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to chat further on what we're doing.
Yeah, she gets
Mhm.
back to you. It's amazing. She responded to me. Now we're here talking. It's
But
fantastic.
you guys are doing really incredible work. So I'm really excited to be able to be a part of this, and to get to know the team. But also, I've seen, actually, when you think about Bitcoin Magazine has actually written quite a lot on some of the challenges in Africa, and you don't really see the narrative anywhere. So I'm really happy that you guys are paying attention as well, and we hope to bring some of our work forward through the magazine and through other places.
The door is always open. Just have to
Thank
shoot me a
you.
DM, of course. And also, it's an honor to have you as our first guest from Africa on this new show, Bitcoin Politics. So super, super exciting. For me, it's just such a privilege to hear from people all over the world who are doing this, and then to also know that those people are in touch, helping to sort of shape proper policy. And I think more than anything, like you said, bring the right voices to the forefront to have
Mhm.
the right discussions. So I think it's really, really exciting what you're doing. Wish you the best of luck. I know deep in my gut, I know you're going to be very successful. So
Thank you very much,
yeah.
Frank.
But anyway, Anais, thank you so much for joining. Everybody, thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back next week. Take it easy, everybody.